At 2:14 in the afternoon, the President of the United States stood at the White House briefing room podium and laughed at Canada's military. Not a subtle dig, not a diplomatic slight wrapped in plausible deniability. A full, performative mockery, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed the audience was entirely on his side. He called Canadian armed forces decorative. He said Canada's fighter jets were basically props. He suggested that a nation of 40 million people sharing the world's longest undefended border with the most powerful military on Earth had constructed something closer to a ceremonial guard than an actual defense force. The press laughed. The base loved it. The clip was already being shared before he finished the sentence. At 2:40 in the afternoon, Mark Carney picked up a secure phone in a quiet Ottawa office, no flags, no ministers, no cameras, and finalized the sale of 41 CF-18 Hornet fighter jets to a European defense coalition comprising Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, and Norway. Not a donation, not a loan. A sale at full market rate plus a strategic premium that the buyers accepted without negotiation, because buying Canadian military equipment at that moment was not just a defense transaction. It was a geopolitical statement, and every government in that coalition knew exactly what statement they were making. The deal was worth 2.7 billion Canadian dollars. It had been 3 months in the making, and it was announced to the world 26 minutes after the President of the United States told the world that Canada's military was not worth taking seriously. Trump gave a speech. Carney made a move, and the difference between those two things is the entire story. But the jet sale was not the move. The jet sale was the signal that the move had already been made 3 months earlier, in quiet rooms that Washington never entered, through a diplomatic operation that ran in plain sight and was never detected. What you are about to hear is the full account of how that operation worked, why the Pentagon went silent for 6 hours after the announcement, what a single NATO phone call did to 3 senior White House advisors, and why military analysts across 4 continents are now calling this the most consequential defense repositioning executed by a non-superpower since the Cold War. This is not a story about jets. This is a story about what happens when a middle power decides to stop asking permission. To understand what Carney did, you have to understand what Trump thought he was doing. The military mockery that Tuesday afternoon was not spontaneous. It was deliberate political theater, calibrated for a domestic audience, designed to reinforce a narrative that had been running for months. Canada is small. Canada is dependent. Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. And any suggestion that Canada could operate as a genuine strategic peer was, in the president's framing, absurd on its face. This was not the first time Trump had mocked Canadian military capacity. It was the third. The first came in February, a passing comment about NATO burden sharing that singled out Canada's defense spending as emblematic of Allied freeloading. The second came in April, during a cabinet meeting partially open to cameras, where Trump made a joke about Canadian Arctic sovereignty that made 3 of his own cabinet members visibly uncomfortable. Military analysts noted both moments. Allied governments noted both moments. And Mark Carney noted both moments and then did something that confused commentators, frustrated the opposition, and completely escaped the attention of the White House. He said nothing. No press conference, no rebuttal. No carefully worded statement of Canadian military pride, no invocation of casualty counts from Afghanistan, where Canadian soldiers died alongside Americans in numbers that made the decorative military framing obscene. Nothing. The silence was so complete and consistent that several Canadian political journalists began asking whether Carney was capable of defending the country's military reputation at all. What they were watching was not weakness. What they were watching was discipline. And discipline at that level, under that kind of sustained provocation, means one thing with certainty: someone is playing a longer game. The question that nobody in Washington thought to ask was how long the game had already been running. The answer was 3 months. 94 days before Trump mocked Canada's military on camera, a German Defense Ministry official landed in Ottawa on a flight logged as a bilateral trade consultation. He was not there to discuss trade. He was there because Canada had quietly communicated, through back channels that deliberately bypassed NATO's formal framework and the Five Eyes intelligence structure, that it had assets available, capacity to offer, and interest in a conversation with European partners serious about defense autonomy. Europe that spring was more serious about defense autonomy than at any point since the Second World War. The war in Ukraine had not ended. American commitment to NATO was, for the first time in alliance history, genuinely uncertain. F-35 delivery timelines were stretched. European air forces needed bridge capacity, operational aircraft to fill fleet gaps, while next-generation procurement worked through parliaments and procurement offices. Canada had exactly that: a fleet of CF-18 Hornets, aging but fully operational, maintained to a standard that European Air Force commanders reviewed and described in private assessments as exceptional. Canada was not selling surplus. Canada was positioning surplus as strategic currency. Surplus is what you offload because you no longer need it. Strategic currency is what you deploy because the moment is right and the leverage is real. Carney's government had determined that the CF-18s were worth more as a diplomatic instrument than as a defense budget line item, and that the right moment to deploy them was not when Canada needed something, but when the contrast would be most visible. The German official was followed over the next 6 weeks by defense representatives from Poland, the Netherlands, and Norway. Every meeting was publicly logged as an economic discussion. Every agenda was listed in terms sufficiently vague to attract zero press interest. 3 European defense ministers flew to Ottawa across 40 days. There was no press coverage. There were no leaks. The operation ran in complete silence through the mechanisms of normal governmental contact, which is precisely why it was invisible. The pricing conversation is where the strategic intent becomes undeniable. Canada did not discount the jets to close the deal. In a normal surplus military sale, the seller discounts because the buyer holds leverage. Canada priced the CF-18s at full market rate, added a premium defense procurement analyst later estimated at 12 to 15% above comparable transactions, and the buyers agreed without a counteroffer, because by that point, the purchase was not purely a defense acquisition. It was a vote. Every government signing understood they were not just buying aircraft. They were publicly declaring where they placed their strategic trust in a transaction that would be announced, reported, and permanently recorded. The market understood the implications before the political analysts did. Canadian defense contractor stocks rose 8% within 90 minutes of the announcement. European defense ETFs spiked across the board. American defense contractors saw analysts quietly begin reassessing their European procurement outlook because a pattern was becoming visible. Europe was actively diversifying away from American defense dependency, and Canada had just demonstrated it could serve as a credible alternative supplier at the premium tier. Goldman Sachs issued a note describing the transaction as evidence that Canada had demonstrated sovereign defense export capacity previously assumed to belong exclusively to Tier 1 military powers. That sentence, written by analysts whose job is precision, is worth reading twice. Previously assumed to belong exclusively to Tier 1 military powers. Canada had moved itself, in the perception of the most influential financial institution on Earth, into a category of strategic actor that nobody in Washington had placed it in. The timing of the announcement was not coincidental. It was engineered. Carney's office knew Trump's press briefing schedule. The sale had been finalized the previous evening. The paperwork was signed. The coalition statement was drafted. The announcement was ready. And then the release was held through the morning, held through the early afternoon, held until 2:40 p.m., 26 minutes after Trump finished telling the world that Canada's military was decorative. A senior Canadian official, speaking on condition of anonymity 3 weeks after the announcement, said, "We didn't time it to embarrass him. We timed it so the market could not miss the contrast." That sentence contains the entire strategic logic. Canada did not need to say a word about the mockery. All Canada needed was for both events to be undeniably, temporally, and publicly connected. Every journalist covering the story had to put both timestamps in the same article. Every headline had to include both facts. The mockery became the context for the sale. The insult became the market signal, and Trump's words, intended to diminish Canadian military credibility, functioned instead as the most effective promotional material the sale could possibly have received. The Allied reaction arrived in waves, and each wave carried more weight than the one before it. Germany's defense minister described the purchase as reflecting Canada's standing as a serious and sovereign defense partner. Poland's prime minister posted a single photograph, himself shaking hands with the Canadian ambassador, no caption, no text. The absence of words was a complete sentence. The UK Defense Secretary said Canada remained one of the most capable and reliable defense partners in the alliance. That sentence, delivered on that specific day, was not routine diplomatic boilerplate. It was a deliberate needle placed with precision by a government that understood exactly what the contrast meant and chose to amplify it. NATO headquarters issued a statement describing the transaction as a demonstration of Allied burden sharing and sovereign defense capacity. When NATO's institutional apparatus expresses satisfaction about a bilateral defense sale on the same afternoon, the American president publicly mocked the seller's military. The statement is not about jets. It is about the relationship between Washington and the rest of the alliance and what the rest of the alliance has concluded about it. And then the Pentagon went quiet. 6 hours. 6 hours of institutional silence from the United States Department of Defense, the most media-active military bureaucracy on the planet, an organization that issues statements about everything, that has a communications infrastructure built to respond to any development anywhere in the world within minutes. 6 hours. When the response finally came, it was 3 sentences, clinical and flat, and it did not mention Canada by name. Three senior Pentagon officials reportedly asked the same question in separate briefings that evening. Did we know this was coming? The answer, according to two people briefed on those conversations, was no. The American intelligence apparatus, with its full signals capability, its Five Eyes partnership with Canada itself, had not detected a 3-month diplomatic operation that produced a $2.7 billion defense sale to America's closest NATO allies. They had not seen it coming. They had not seen it running. They had seen nothing. The Pentagon was not embarrassed by the jets. The Pentagon was embarrassed by the silence that preceded them, because what the silence revealed was not a gap in signals intelligence, it was a gap in relational intelligence. The capacity to understand what an ally is building, what an ally is prepared to do, not because they are broadcasting it, but because you know them well enough to read the quiet. Washington had spent 18 months treating Canada as a subordinate rather than a partner, and when Canada moved, Washington was the last to know. None of what happened that Tuesday landed in isolation. It landed on top of 18 months of compounding damage, none of which had been resolved, all of which was still bleeding, every one of which had made the American position weaker, more expensive, and more politically unsustainable with each passing week. The tariffs had cost American consumers an estimated $47 billion in higher prices. Lumber costs pushed housing starts down across border states. Auto parts tariffs added an average of $3,200 to vehicles assembled in American plants, with Canadian components. Agricultural tariffs hit grocery bills in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Maine, with increases that appeared in every monthly consumer price report and could not be explained away. The energy suspension had placed 7 states in declared energy emergencies. Natural gas prices in the Midwest had doubled. Heating oil futures reached levels not seen in a decade. Families in New England were spending a quarter of their monthly income on winter heating, and the Department of Energy's internal models projected that without restored Canadian supply, rationing protocols would need activation for the first time since the 1970s. The uranium repositioning had locked Canadian nuclear fuel into contracts with France, Japan, South Korea, India, and the United Kingdom for the next 15 to 20 years. 93 American reactors generating 20% of the nation's electricity were operating on supply chain assumptions that no longer reflected reality. The Pentagon had classified the situation as a readiness concern, and that classification sat in briefings like a slow fire that everyone could smell and nobody wanted to name. The diplomatic severance had created logistical chaos along 5,500 miles of shared border. The airspace closure had cost American Airlines over $3 billion annually in rerouting. The copper redirection had doubled wire costs, eliminated 47,000 electrical contracting jobs, and paused 14 hospital construction projects in states that had voted for the administration. The Canadian Strategic Resource Authority passed unanimously with 338 votes in favor and 0 against, consolidating every Canadian strategic export under sovereign governmental control was permanent. It did not expire. It was not going away. And now on top of all of it, 41 jets, sold to Europe, priced at a premium, announced 26 minutes after a public mockery, with 3 months of invisible diplomatic groundwork beneath them, like the submerged mass of an iceberg that everyone had been sailing toward and nobody had seen. This was not a new escalation. This was the latest installment of a strategy running since the first tariff. Each move built on the last. Each move removed one more option from Washington's table, quietly, permanently, without announcement, until the table had almost nothing left on it. And the cumulative effect arrived in a room in Washington that evening. The National Security Council meeting was called at 7 o'clock. Scheduled for 1 hour, it lasted 4.5. The National Security Advisor opened by placing 2 documents on the table: the Pentagon's 6-hour silence report and the European Coalition Joint Statement, already being cited in parliamentary debates in Berlin, Warsaw, Amsterdam, and Oslo. He said nothing. He let the room read. The Secretary of Defense spoke first. According to 3 people present, he said, "We just watched a NATO ally execute a sovereign defense pivot that took us 3 years to see coming in Afghanistan. That is an intelligence failure and a relationship failure simultaneously, and those 2 failures have the same root cause." The root cause he named was the administration's systematic treatment of allied relationships as transactional dependencies rather than strategic partnerships. He did not use diplomatic language. He used the language of a man who had spent 40 years in uniform and was not interested in protecting anyone's feelings. The Secretary of State said nothing for the first 90 minutes. When she spoke, she said 7 words. Every ally watching this is taking notes. The room understood them completely. The political director presented polling rushed into the field in the 48 hours following the sale. In swing states with significant defense industry employment, perception of American military prestige had shifted downward for the first time in the survey's history, not capability. Prestige. Because prestige is not about what you can do. It is about whether other nations believe you are the kind of partner worth aligning with. Canada had demonstrated in a single afternoon that it was exactly that kind of partner. Trump resisted. He blamed Carney. He blamed the European governments for disloyalty. He proposed retaliations the Treasury Secretary told him would accelerate the damage. He proposed framing the jet sale as a hostile act. His communications director told him the public already blamed the White House by a margin that made that framing politically unsurvivable. One by one, the arguments were exhausted. One by one, the alternatives were eliminated. And then the room went quiet. The president sat in silence for what multiple witnesses estimated at 2 to 3 minutes. When he spoke, he did not propose another escalation. He said, "What do we do now?" It was not a question. It was the sound of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. The room did not end in surrender that night. It ended in something almost worse, the recognition that the surrender had already happened, that it had happened 3 months earlier in a quiet Ottawa meeting room when 4 European defense ministers agreed to buy Canadian jets at a premium, and nobody in Washington had been in that room, and nobody in Washington had known, and the consequences of not knowing were now sitting on a table in the West Wing in the form of 2 documents that nobody wanted to pick up and nobody could put down. Mark Carney did not hold a press conference. His office issued a single paragraph describing the transaction in language so deliberately understated it read, to anyone not paying close attention, like a routine procurement announcement. The statement described the sale as consistent with Canada's commitment to Allied security and NATO burden-sharing obligations. It used the word routine. It mentioned no names. It referenced nothing else that had happened that day. The word routine was the final move. Not the jets, not the timing. The word routine. Carney framed a $2.7 billion strategic defense pivot as nothing, which forced every journalist covering it to explain why it was not nothing, which required explaining the 26-minute gap, which required quoting the mockery, which meant that Trump's words appeared in permanent public juxtaposition with the transaction that followed them in every article written in every language in every country for the following 2 weeks. Carney said routine, the world said otherwise, and the gap between those two things is where the entire story lived. A lesser leader would have held a press conference. A lesser leader would have stood at a podium and let the contrast speak directly. Carney did none of that, because the winner who does not celebrate communicates something far more devastating, that the outcome was never in doubt. Trump saw a decorative military. He saw a middle power playing dress-up with jets it would never seriously deploy in a country too small and too dependent to make meaningful strategic choices without American approval. That is what he saw. That is what he said. And the confidence with which he said it is the most important part of the story, because it tells you exactly what he did not see. He did not see 3 months of back-channel diplomacy running underneath every public confrontation. He did not see the European defense ministers landing in Ottawa and leaving with frameworks. He did not see the pricing strategy, the coalition statement, the deliberately held announcement. He did not see any of it because he had spent 18 months treating Canada as an object of policy rather than a subject of strategy. And objects do not make moves. Subjects do. Carney treated military assets as instruments, not symbols, not sources of national pride to defend rhetorically. Instruments, things you position, price, time, and deploy in service of a larger objective. The CF-18s were not Canada's military pride. They were a $2.7 billion diplomatic instrument loaded into position over 3 months and triggered at the precise moment when the contrast would be permanent, visible, and impossible to explain away. Trump was performing power. Carney was using it. And between those two things, there is a distance that no press briefing, no tariff, no escalation can close, because performing power and using it are not different degrees of the same thing. They are different things entirely. One makes noise. The other makes history. The most dangerous thing you can do to an opponent is not match their aggression. It is make their aggression irrelevant. Trump mocked a military. Carney sold it, profitably, strategically, to the allies Trump needed, 26 minutes later. The mockery became the advertisement. The insult became the market signal. And the jets that Trump called decorative are now flying over European airspace, paid for by America's closest allies, as a permanent reminder that the nation Trump called a marching band was the entire time running a symphony. Trump saw a middle power. Carney saw a permanent advantage. And the difference between what those two men saw is the difference between who won and who is still standing at a podium, trying to figure out when the game started.